board. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here this morning. My name is Annie Armstrong and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Natural Resources. And I have been working with Danielle Eisman from the Cornell Institute for Climate Smart Solutions, who's also on the call, to get together some webinar speakers and put together a little series of what we're calling virtual seminars on climate change, on different topics on climate change, because we have such an awesome climate change education and communication and action network going from our Civic Ecology Lab online courses that we wanted to keep it going and then also learn new things ourselves. Danielle, do you want to do a quick introduction? Oh, is Danielle still there?
Sorry, I was on mute. Sure, yeah. Hi, I'm Danielle Eisman. I work at the Cornell Institute for Climate Smart Solutions, as Annie mentioned. And I don't know what else to say about myself.
Okay.
That's good enough.
Okay. Thanks. So I'm so happy to have Elise Trelegan, the BWEET program coordinator from the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office, here on the call with us today. I worked with Elise for several years when we were working at the Chesapeake Bay Field Station together, and it's a pleasure to continue working with her. So I know that this, I know that Elise is we're talking about meaningful watershed education experiences, but it's going to really link into climate literacy and how to do really cool climate change programming. So just excited to have Elise here. If you're just coming on, this call is being recorded and will be posted on our Facebook pages, will be sent out via email to the Civic Ecology Lab listservs, and will be posted, we'll put it on WeChat as well, for those of you who are in China. Okay, so thanks very much. I'm going to hand it over to Elise.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Like Annie said, my name's Elise. I'm the program coordinator for NOAA's Bay Watershed Education and Training Program in the Chesapeake region, and we call that BWEET. Just really quickly, I'm sure most people on the call know what NOAA is. At least you're probably familiar with the logo, which I realize is a little bit fuzzy on my screen at least. NOAA takes the heartbeat of the planet by studying the Earth's atmosphere, oceans, coasts, climate, and weather. And we're really working to understand and predict the changes in these realms, which connects really well to this climate piece, and then communicate that information with the public and work with them to conserve and manage the ecosystems and resources of our coastal and marine spaces. Oh, I'm just having, there we go.
Yes, oh sorry, you got it.
So kind of what we're up to today. This morning, I'm going to tell you a bit about the environmental literacy work that's going on in our region, tell you about this approach that we're using and why it's particularly relevant to educating about climate topics. And then I'm going to show you at least one example of a case study of of a person who's doing some work around climate using this MWEE framework. And then finally, I'll leave you with a couple of resources if this is something new for you that you'd like to use in your programming or learn more about, those options are there. So to kind of start off, we're going to be talking about this educational approach called the Meaningful Watershed Educational Experience. And just to kind of set the context a little bit and give you a little bit of reference, the NOAA office that I work for is the Chesapeake Bay office, which is located in Annapolis, Maryland. It's about 2 hours from the capital of Washington, D.C., and we sit on the Chesapeake Bay, which is really rich in history and natural beauty. It's the largest estuary in the United States, and it's home to a wide variety of plants and animals, and of course, people. And so the health of the Chesapeake Bay faces a number of threats, ranging from poor water quality to vulnerable habitats, and of course, climate change. So since back in 1983, we stakeholders have been partnering under this thing called the Chesapeake Bay Program. It's basically a consortium of nonprofits, government agencies, state agencies, universities, a variety of partners coming together, and there are these written agreements to restore the estuary. And there's this guiding document that was signed by the governors of each watershed state, and it's known as the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. And that's pretty important for just understanding what the environmental literacy context is as we move forward through this presentation. So in 2014, the agreement evolved slightly for the better to incorporate this like human dimension. And so among other things that were added to the agreement was this thing called the environmental literacy goal. And this goal asks for students in the region to graduate with the knowledge and the skills to act responsibly to protect and restore their local watershed. Basically, it's acknowledging that young people are our future decision makers, and it really highlights the importance of formal and non-formal education in molding students to become stewards of the environment. So you can see on the right side here, there's 3 different outcomes that are associated with this goal. There's one that focuses on students, one focuses on sustainable schools, and the other one on environmental literacy planning. So we have this really robust framework that's in place that's pushing all of these this work forward. And so the student outcome is what I'm going to be really talking about today, which asks for every student in elementary, middle, and high school to have at least one of these meaningful watershed educational experiences throughout their academic career. So by the time they graduate from high school, they've had 3 MWEEs given the appropriate resources. And speaking of appropriate resources, that's kind of where NOAA comes into play. We provide this funding mechanism known as BWET, which is what I work on. And we're committed to this approach for systemic environmental literacy, both at the local level. So we chair the education work group for the Bay Program, but we also have adopted this approach to learning nationally as our baseline for what environmental literacy can really look like. So the BWET program is this funding mechanism, and we serve 7 regions. The Chesapeake Bay region is the oldest and the largest, and we have quite a few people in our watershed that have received BWET funding that supports this thing, the Meaningful Watershed Educational Experience. So what is this MWEE thing? I'm just curious if you want to type into the chat if you've heard of a MWEE or if you've participated in a MWEE. That's kind of helpful for me as we're kind of going through this, but I'm going to go under the assumption that most people probably haven't heard of a MWEE before or maybe haven't participated in one. Annie, were you going to chime in?
Oh, I was just going to say that I think the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, just thinking on an international level, I was wondering whether people had examples of sort of that kind of landscape scale watershed management, because it's a pretty amazing, it's just it's cool that it exists.
Yeah, so if anybody has any examples of what that looks like in other spaces, I'd definitely love to know. I'm sure it's not the first, but it's definitely a really comprehensive approach.
Okay, so we have Jennifer, who's on the Eastern Shore doing MWEEs on the Eastern Shore of Virginia with BWET funding.
Yay!
At the Virginia Coast Reserve.
Is that Jennifer from TNC?
Yeah. Jeff hasn't heard of it, but thanks us for the seminar. So we have several people who haven't heard about this approach before.
Okay. So Jen, if you want to chime in at any time to kind of give your perspective when we actually get to the case studies part, you should feel welcome to do that, because I know you all are doing a lot of work around coastal resilience and climate. Sorry,
Elise, before we move on, I forgot to say at the beginning that if anybody has questions while Elise is talking, please feel free to put those in the chat. I'm going to be watching the chat, and so can either respond to them if I know the answer, or cache them for later, or stop Elise and ask her to clarify things, if that's okay with Elise.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
So this MWEE framework is built on best practices. So they're learner-centered experiences that focus on investigations into local environmental issues, and they ideally lead to informed action and/or civic engagement. And all the while, they're connecting to standards-based classroom learning. So in a real sense, MWEEs are really just a specific kind of project-based learning. They support state science and social studies standards. They align with STEM education, NGSS, Common Core, and the C3 framework. And the really important thing to know about MWEEs is they're not meant to be something extra. Rather, they're supposed to be a tool for meeting multiple objectives. So our student objectives, our teacher objectives, and oftentimes partners working alongside, we're meeting the mission of their organizations as well.
Hey, Elise?
Yeah.
Sorry, what is the C3 framework?
The C3 framework is the social studies framework. I think it's college, career, and civic life, I believe.
Oh, okay, thanks.
But it's another three-dimensional approach, so it's really similar to NGSS, I would say, in that it's kind of looking from that kind of 3D perspective.
And then NGSS, for those of you who are outside of the US, is the next generation science standards, are sort of kind of recently passed science standards in the US.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have clarified that. Thanks, Annie. So I'm going to show a really quick video. Oh, and I think it might start before I even click it. There we go. And this is just kind of a promotional video that we have put out for people to just get a kind of glossy overview of kind of what a MWEE is. I hope the audio will come through clear, but if it doesn't, feel free to specifically maybe not listen to the words so much as to look at the text that's coming across the screen and some of those visuals.
Is it steep or flat? Very cloudy? Okay. 7 is heaven for living things.
If you see a non-native invasive, point your finger in that direction.
Oh my God.
But between 0 and 4,
What do you think? 4 or 5?
as a scientist, the way you find out is you conduct an experiment.
I wanted to learn more about plants, especially from like this side of the world. In a classroom, we don't get the hands-on experience versus here, like we actually get to see the things. We actually get to like identify.
She said it, Taylor.
But the volume of water is going to be very high. Like anywhere that you see conifers, like on top of this hill here, mountain.
All watershed.
So since if it's okay with you all, I'd love to hear kind of reflections on what people are, you don't know necessarily what the definition of a MWEE is, but like, what do you get from that video? What does it make you think of? Does it remind you of the programs that you run or the ones that you've participated in? If you want to type into the chat and maybe Annie can report out on that, that would be great.
Sure. And Rebecca's asking if we can get a link to that video, Elise, and it looks like it's at the Bay Backpack site.
Yes.
Okay.
And I should have a link to Bay Backpack on my final slide.
Okay, cool. So maybe in a second I can find the link and then I can put it in the chat too.
Perfect.
So Marianne says it seems to integrate action with learning. And what is the program's position on this? How do you view the intersections between action and learning and literacy, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's definitely like an action component to the MWEE that's embedded somewhere into the experience. Yeah, certainly.
And how does that tie? Because maybe you'll go into, I know there's like an entire environmental literacy model that goes along with this from the Bay Backpack program, right? That like, so the action is part of that literacy model? Yeah.
And so there are kind of these 4 essential elements that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, but the idea is that they can kind of happen anywhere during the learning, but we're doing some more thinking around that. And, there's a lot of research that points to informed action as really allowing for those kind of stewardship and civic involvement outcomes to really, be kind of what students are left with. And so we kind of recommend maybe that action isn't the first thing that students are do. And if it is, then there's some sort of informed action that happens at the end of the MWEE. So I know that's a little bit nebulous right now, but I think once I talk about all the essential elements, people will have a better idea of it. But
okay. And Yakia says kind of like linking, so it looks like you were linking environmental education with science, with school science education, and those can be different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a key part to the MWEE, is that it's this partnership, that there's always a teacher that's involved in this. So not that there's anything whatsoever wrong with non-school-based programming or anything like that, but the MWEE specifically taps into that kind of K-12, that K-12 audience by using the school systemically to implement these meaningful watershed educational experiences. And oftentimes partners are integral to those as well. All right, so I'll move on here, but if you all have more reflections or questions, feel free to chime in. So as you might have gleaned from the video, there are these kind of 4 essential elements that rolled across the screen. And then in addition to those essential elements, there are also 4 supporting practices. And these kind of 8 things, they build upon each other to create this comprehensive learning experience for students. I'm going to talk specifically about these essential elements. And when I talk about essential elements, these are kind of what students do. And the supporting practices are what teachers do. So, and like I said, these don't come in any particular order, but this is just the order that they're in the guide. Issue definition is that time where students, they focus on an environmental issue, problem, or phenomenon that requires background research and investigation. Typically, like in a lot of project-based or problem-based learning, there's a driving question that focuses the inquiry, and students develop supporting questions around the topic to better understand the issue at hand. So this happens at kind of different scales depending on, elementary, middle, and high school, but ideally the students are coming up with those supporting questions to guide the rest of the investigations. Sometimes those questions are co-developed with teachers, or, in kindergarten, maybe it looks a little bit different, right? Because this is a K-12 framework. These investigations address the driving question and supporting questions, and they're answered through classroom instruction, the collection of data, conducting experiments, talking to experts, and reviewing credible publications. So this whole process should be age appropriate, with practices that grow in complexity and sophistication across grades. And it starts with that educator-guided investigation, and it progresses to student-led inquiry. The second essential element is outdoor field experiences or investigations. So during the MWEE, students participate in 1 or more field investigations. So this is what makes it a little different than project-based learning, is we require students to go outdoors. And these outdoor field investigations have to be sufficient to investigate the problem issue or phenomenon. So it's not going outside for going outside's sake. Students are actively involved in planning the investigation if possible. They take measurements, they construct the project within kind of appropriate safety guidelines, and have, teachers are guiding on the side throughout all of this. These activities can take place on-site or off-site. So it could be on your school grounds, it could be going out to a state park, it could be going to a nature center or field station. And the outdoor field experiences can be led by teachers or by partner organizations. However, throughout the entire process, there's always a direct tie and connection to what's going on in the classroom. And really best practices here are that the teachers are involved in the outdoor field investigations, and partners come into play here by providing professional development for teachers so that they're more comfortable when they actually get outside. So synthesis and conclusions, this happens throughout the entire process. And like education has a little and a big E, I like to say that synthesis and conclusions has a little and a big SC. So throughout the process, students are identifying, synthesizing, and applying evidence from their investigations to draw conclusions and to make claims. So synthesizing data could look like creating graphs, tables, charts, making maps. It could be reflecting internally through journal writing. It could be reflecting externally through talking to their peers. And at the end of the series of investigations, so after each investigation, there's synthesis and conclusions. Basically, it's time to reflect on what just happened. So after you go outside, coming back and using that time to really think about how it connects back to our driving question. But then at the end of the investigations, students compile all of their conclusions, and they make a claim about the issue, problem, or phenomenon that they had been investigating. So, and this claim is really essential for the next step in the MWEE, which is stewardship and or civic action. So this is where students identify and implement an age-appropriate solution for action. And these solutions address the conclusions and the claims that are drawn through those investigations. Action projects They really range in size, scope, and scale, and it depends on a variety of factors. The time that teachers have to do this, the funding that they have available, and of course the ideas of their students. So this is another place where partners can come into play to support these efforts. And there are kind of 4 bins of action projects that we see that commonly come out of MWEEs. And I'll just really quickly run into kind of what those are. So watershed restoration and protection. So that's exactly what you think. It's your boots on the ground, planting trees or removing invasive species or doing some sort of BMP, best management practice, stormwater management. Another bin is like those everyday choices. So those are things like reduce, reuse, recycle, energy conservation, water conservation, community engagement. Those are things like doing presentations or creating a social media campaign, organizing an event, doing a PSA for your local PTA committee. And then finally, civic engagement, which is, of course, connecting back to those elected officials who are making decisions. So either writing your local officials, meeting with them to learn about different policy aspects, or even participating in a voting campaign. So those are kind of 3 bins, and you can see that they really range in size and scope. So it's important to select something that works best for you. But the most important part of the stewardship and civic action piece, and I hope it's come through in the other essential elements that I discussed, is that it's student focused and really student directed. So this is where there's an opportunity for students to really think creatively and innovatively about the actions that directly address the problem. The ones that I mentioned, those aren't the only answers to action. Did you want to jump in, Annie? Sorry, I just thought I heard somebody. Just kidding.
No, I think, but Mary Ann clarified, so PSA equals public service announcement, if you didn't see that.
I'm really sorry. I'll try not to use so many acronyms. And so, yeah, this is where that student-directed learning really comes into play. And, you know, your students might not come up with the exact, you know, right answer in your mind, but this is an opportunity for them to really brainstorm and think big about what's going to connect back to their issue. And the goal here is for it to be a really seamless process, and not for, if you're doing, for example, water quality testing on a local creek or something like that, they're looking at water quality and water chemistry. The action project shouldn't be doing a trash cleanup, because that's too many steps away, right? It's not really answering the question that they have. So it's just one important thing to consider that I like to point out. Then there are those supporting practices. Those are the things that teachers do. I'm not going to get into these too much because they're pretty self-explanatory, but active teacher support means that teachers are facilitating the student learning. They're ensuring that all those essential elements really support the academic goals of the classroom. Local context, so place-based education promotes learning that's rooted in the history, the environment, and the culture of the student's community. And this really offers the opportunity for students to explore how individual and collective decisions impact their immediate surroundings. So I think I'm preaching to the choir here talking about local context. Classroom integration, so experiences should be linked to what's going on in the classroom. They fit into the scope and sequence of what students are learning. And then sustained activity. This is the one that's sometimes most challenging for folks. So this is a series of investigations and activities that happen over time. So it's not one field trip. That's not what a MWEE is. A MWEE is this series of activities that are integral to a unit of study. And each component of the MWEE should involve significant investment of instructional time, incorporate time for reflection, and they should include all students. So just think to yourself for a minute, does the MWEE seem familiar to you? Are these elements or aspects of other elements or aspects of a MWEE that you might be already doing? And really, if there are, that's kind of the point of the MWEE. It takes what K-12 teachers are already doing and it overlays what non-formal educators kind of do best. So the approach is situated in best practices for environmental education, like I said, including project-based learning, problem-based project and problem-based learning, place-based learning, among many others. This is just a quote from one of our Department of Education heads. out here in Virginia, and it really brings back home that the MWEE approach provides this scaffolding for developing more environmentally aware and hopefully more active citizens. And so as we consider climate change as the greatest threat facing our communities today, we recognize this enormous responsibility that we have to educate young people. And so this is kind of, we have this thing called the Meaningful Watershed, the Educator's Guide for the Meaningful Watershed Education Experience, and we kind of call out what the MWEE does for students. And these are kind of the 4 points that come out of this, but I think in particular, the 2 bottom points maybe resonate most with this audience. So advancing 21st century skills. MWEEs engage students in these real world experiences, and they support the development of skills related to life and career, learning and innovation, information, media, and technology, while also learning these key subjects. So students practice these skills through the Meaningful Watershed Educational Experience. And by doing this, they have the opportunity to think critically, solve problems, and employ analytical and higher order thinking skills, as well as communicating effectively, which we know is so important in climate education. MWEEs also promote that environmental stewardship and civic engagement piece. So by getting students actively involved in their learning around environmental issues, they can better understand the issues and then see themselves in those future solutions. So this is why I kind of think that the MWEE works really well within this kind of climate literacy conversation. So they're multidisciplinary. MWEEs address complex issues, and often more than just the natural and the social issues, they have a wide range of implications. They require students to use higher order thinking, including analysis, inference, prediction, and evaluation. And they oftentimes include concepts and practices from a whole bunch of different disciplines. So ultimately, MWEEs offer an opportunity for students to apply that systems thinking approach, and it connects pretty neatly with next generation science standards, the C3 framework, and other three-dimensional learning applications. We know the importance of understanding identity and values when talking to our audiences about climate change, and the MWEE specifically asks students to reflect on their personal values as well as public values. They explore different perspectives related to the issue from the very start. So during issue definition, it's written right into kind of that part of issue definition. They revisit these different perspectives and values during synthesis and conclusions, and ultimately they use those to inform their action project. Frameworks and other research-based climate communication has shown the importance of kind of filling those cognitive gaps with explanatory chains and taking that thread and pulling it all the way through. And because MWEEs start with the driving question and students co-create or create their own supporting questions to fully investigate the issue at hand, they're in a real sense filling that chain so that then in the end they can use claim evidence reasoning to support the why for their action. And because MWEEs are not happening just during one field trip, it really allows for that longer term learning to happen. Here's an example of one of the MWEEs that kind of came out of our Climate Academy this past summer, which I'll talk about a little bit more, but you can see that there's a driving question, there's a supporting question, and then with those supporting questions, there's an investigation, and then synthesis and conclusions that happens afterwards. So this kind of runs students through, and it's really, like I said, it's student directed, so it's actually running themselves through this whole process and being able to use the evidence to inform their next question, which ultimately leads to that action piece. And this is probably the most, of all the reasons why MWEEs might be a strong approach for using with climate topics, I think this is probably the most compelling. MWEEs are inherently solutions focused. They put the students in the driver's seat to identify opportunities for action that are innovative and community focused. So they're doing this work right in their own communities where they already have influence and partnerships, which are key for success when we're talking about these sorts of action pieces. And the solutions foster hope and instill that sense of efficacy and agency. we run this, NOAA as well as a couple of partners in the Mid-Atlantic region run this Summer Climate Academy that came out of the Made Clear, it's an NSF funded project, and I honestly can't remember what Made Clear stands for, but it's a really long acronym. One arm of the project was to create this model of professional development for teachers in Maryland and Delaware to learn about how to implement climate content into their classrooms. And this past summer, we fully embedded the MWEE model into this. So we're giving teachers both the approach and the content with some flexibility, of course, to build out a program that they can meet their academic standards and kind of check that MWEE box with. So the structure of the course looked a little something like this. So we hosted a webinar much like this to kind of get people acquainted and know the expectations. We're asking a lot of these teachers, so we provided them with a stipend and with CPD continuing professional development credits. We then all met online virtually for an 8-week online course, which is where we covered a lot of that kind of climate content. So we got all of that really in-depth information out of the way. They participated in discussions and reflected on their experiences. But then when we met in the summertime for a 3-day academy, which was the in-person part, which really was, full days of information and content and activities, we modeled the MWEE. So going through issue definition, outdoor field experiences, synthesis of conclusions, and then designing an action project. At the end of those 3 days, we asked the teachers to create an implementation plan using the ELM planning tools, which is the environmental literacy model. I'll show you that in a couple minutes. So basically, they're planning how they're going to implement a MWEE in their classrooms using some of the content that they learned through this course. Then in August, we did a follow-up at Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. We learned a little bit about what they're doing there for fun, but they presented on their implementation plans. And one of the kind of cool outcomes that came from this is a lot of the teachers decided to work as teams to create these really robust programs that maybe have more of a chance to be ingrained into curriculum or to be sustained over a longer period of time. So that support system was really important. These are a couple of shots from the Climate Academy, and I struggled to decide what kind of sample climate MWEE to put up here, but this one I think might resonate with some folks here. So this was a teacher who, he takes the students every year to Janes Island State Park, and it's like this field trip that's been really popular and it's really well known that all the students kind of anticipated at the end of every year. And he had his students investigating the question of how will sea level rise impact Janes Island State Park. And so they tapped into something that was already part of the curriculum, and then he designed an investigation around the area that the kids really care about because it's relatively local and it's significant since they all look forward to the field trip. It gets, passed down from sibling to sibling and friend to friend. So during the outdoor field, or during the issue investigation, he started this really far before the actual field trip, or the outdoor field experience, I should say. So learning the basics of climate, the difference between climate and weather, what's causing climate change, and then looking at what the projections are for their area. And for those of you who don't know, the eastern shore of Maryland is pretty low-lying and will be significantly impacted by sea level rise. So with the outdoor field experience, that's when they went for their, typical field trip at Janes Island. He had his students using those emery rods that you see there in the picture to measure elevation change at the park. And he had them, reflecting on the projections of sea level rise that they had been seeing in the classroom, and they used chalk to kind of delineate where the impacts might be. In particular, they were looking at what pieces of infrastructure might be at risk. And he actually, this is kind of one of those cool things that comes out of the MWEE because it is student directed. He hadn't anticipated this, but there was an opportunity to talk to some of the park rangers that were there, and his students really started that conversation. So they were asking questions about what the rangers are doing and how they're kind of preparing for sea level rise in this park. So it was kind of like one of those cool outcomes. And then with the action project, they decided to create an awareness campaign of the impacts of sea level rise, directly connecting it back to that human-caused climate change. And the students prepared this little booklet to educate future students and parents who would be attending the field trip. So like I said, action projects, they can be, really big in scale, or they could be something simple. This happens at the end of the year, so they knew that there wasn't going to be a ton of time to create some sort of boots on the ground, big infrastructure-based or anything like that sort of project. So this is something that was reasonable within the scope, and this, like, the kids decided to do it. They, some students drew their books and other kids made them online. So they were really able to tap into the different talents and interests of their students. So that's one example among many others. I guess I wanted to spend just a minute and have you reflect on, can you imagine what a climate MWEE could look like maybe in your context? So think about what those issues are that resonate most in your local area, and then what resources you're already using or what sorts of programs you already organize and what that might be able to look like. Annie, do you think you could report out from the chat again?
Yeah, we've got a little conversation going on about, Marianne asked about, because we have several people from China on the call right now. And so she's wondering, she said she'd heard that the science education standards are changing to incorporate more investigative experiences. She wasn't sure about the action component, but wondering whether, what this might look like in the Chinese context. And so we have a few people who have answered that the education system is shifting in China, and that families are really interested in this kind of activity there, and that China's recently remodeled its science education standards to look like the UK system, but that scores are still really important for middle school students and especially high school students. Mm-hmm. So it's just interesting to think about what, because we're actually going to be running a course on environment. We're developing a course with the Nature Conservancy in China. Yue Li is developing a postdoc in our lab. We'll be developing an environmental STEM course with the Nature Conservancy in China. And so this would be probably of interest to them, but also good to think about what that looks like in China.
Yeah.
And then Danielle, maybe you want to chime in about your ideas for your food course that you're doing with students.
Oh, yeah. Because I run workshops at a lot of youth climate summits, so I've been trying to find ways to use food to engage students and educate them about climate change. So I think this approach of looking at solutions could be a really great thing to incorporate into some of the work that I'm doing with students of all ages. So I look forward to kind of digging into those guides that you posted and seeing how I could apply it.
And Elise, we've had a couple questions just kind of moving through the chat about what a MWEE the mechanics of a MWEE on a day-to-day basis. So one person asked about, so how often should you be going out, or how often should a child during a MWEE, how often should somebody be going out in the field? And could you accomplish a MWEE in a 3 to 4 day visit at a residential center?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So it 100% looks different in every single context. So, an example would be, we have a teacher here in Wicomico County where I live who does this MWEE that really extends throughout an entire semester. So she braids in these different pieces, and then it's really, when the students kind of come back to this first, they look at, what they do is they actually look at local articles in the newspaper, and so they're kind of collecting these current events throughout the semester. And then they come back to kind of what some of the big themes are. And this year, of course, the big theme on the Eastern Shore is flooding. And so they, dig into that a little bit deeper during their last week. So they spend about a week on that really deep issue definition piece. And then they go out for an outdoor field experience to look and do an inventory at some of the areas. We've had some big road washouts, so they go out there and look at, why things maybe are happening. And then connect back to the climate unit that they, did a couple of units ago. So it's a kind of a string that comes through. Other MWEEs happen, during maybe a week-long or a unit-long period in the classroom. So could Could a MWEE happen during a residential outdoor field experience? I think yes. But something that would be pretty significantly important would be that there's that active teacher involvement, which you don't always see during residential programs. So I think that would be pretty important. And then also, it's that dialogue between non-formal educators and formal educators to ensure that it's really integrated into the scope and sequence of the curriculum. So it's not just like this thing that's plopped in the middle of earth and space science, right? It's something that makes sense for the students.
I'm wondering for our museum studies people in Cooperstown, I'm wondering whether you have any ongoing projects with formal educators that kind of take the shape of a meaningful watershed education experience or similar to that, or whether this would be a totally new kind of partnership for you guys. Oh, and you know what? And you can, if you wanted to unmute yourself in Cooperstown, you'd be welcome to. Well, we'll just think about it.
And something else that was brought up, I can't remember who brought it up now at the very beginning about testing, and that's like our biggest obstacle when it comes to the MWEE is, hearing from teachers that, testing. So it's important to consider how you're doing assessment around the MWEE and, making sure that you're hitting those objectives and really hitting those standards. I mean, with a MWEE, you could potentially hit 3 or 4, maybe even 5 standards, depending on really what the scope of it looks like. So, being realistic is really important. This isn't just like a fluffy thing to add on to what you're doing because it's cool, right? It's meeting the needs of a whole bunch of people, teachers, administrators, non-formals, and of course, students.
Mm-hmm.
Should I move on?
I think so.
Okay. So there's this MWEE thing. We work in the Chesapeake Bay region. It's a really huge area. And you guys have heard me talk a little bit about the MWEE now, so it's kind of this complex, but really a model, an approach that makes a lot of sense. But every year we do, or every 2 years rather, we do an environmental literacy survey that goes out to all the districts in the Chesapeake Bay region to kind of ask them what they need to better support environmental literacy. And year after year, of course, funding comes in right at the top, no surprise. But teacher professional development has been coming up as pretty consistently. So we decided that there was an opportunity to create some consistent PD that really hammers home what the MWEE is all about. Because the other thing to know about this is that the MWEE has really evolved over the past 10, 15 years or so. So it's looked very different. And now we kind of have this strong research-based approach that we're moving forward with. So we decided to create this online course that would underpin that consistent understanding, that would support professional development across the watershed and beyond. And that's probably many of you on the call today is the and beyond. In our region, we have some really rural areas of Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. So this would make the MWEE framework a lot more accessible. We do regular MWEE workshops here in, Annapolis and Richmond and Charlottesville, but we can't be everywhere. And doing something so robust as the Climate Academy was, we know that it was a really successful model based on our evaluation data, but and the rate of implementation, but that's not like actually reasonable when it comes to getting the word out about this and really getting people to dig in. So this online course creates an opportunity for that enhanced dialogue. And then during PD, it allows for people to focus more on those field-based experiences, which is usually where teachers need a little bit more assistance. So the online course allows people to come in with this understanding of what the MWEE is, what it looks like. And we do that through a series of case studies, videos like the one you saw earlier, as well as a deeper dive. And the textbook for this is really this thing called the Educator's Guide to the Meaningful Watershed Educational Experience. It's a manual for constructing high quality educational experiences. So it kind of digs into what each of those essential elements are. And then it has a series of tools in the back. This is what the MWEE online course looks like. I'll give you all the link to this so you can refer to it or check it out if you're interested. There's kind of there's 3 lessons rather within the MWEE 101 course. So it's kind of that why MWEE, which we talked a little bit about, but it dives more into the scholarship and where it comes from within the Bay program. The second lesson talks specifically about the essential elements and supporting practices, and it gets you thinking about what a MWEE looks like in your context. So you actually complete one of the tools called the Think Cloud, which is like our most simple tool that allows people to really start brainstorming about what a MWEE could look like in their context. And then that third lesson has the case studies that you've been following throughout the course. You look at their environmental literacy plans, which are these guys here. So this is that really in-depth planning document that helps you think about all those different investigations and all those standards that you'll hit, and what the opportunities are for outdoor field experiences and action. And this is just an example. There's actually another page that goes on here that for some reason didn't make it onto the slide that is that focuses on that stewardship and civic action piece. So this is just an example, and during that third lesson, participants look at these completed ELMs, and they use the audit tool, which is in the back of the MWEE guide, to help assess how closely this MWEE is really following the model that we've put out there. So applications for the MWEE course, we hope that it will be a standalone resource, so you can use it whenever you'd like to. There's no cost associated with it. It's just a go check it out kind of thing. It could be used in blended professional development. There's a lot of opportunities for how this could be incorporated. Or you could just use some of the elements like those videos in your PD programs or whatever it is that you might be up to. And I'm sure there are other applications too that maybe we haven't heard of yet. For example, Towson University out in Baltimore, they're going to be using it for pre-service teachers to teach them about what the MWEE is before they even get into the classroom. So they're coming in with like that leg up. So it's a really exciting application for us. Bay Backpack is another resource that I encourage you all to check out. It's a one-stop shop for anything related to the MWEE, but also Chesapeake Bay issues. But I would even extend it further to ideas for action projects and what kind of the green schools and sustainable schools looks like. There's a lot of information on there. It ranges from kind of curriculum ideas, programming, what field experiences could look like I said, action projects. There's just a lot of information on there. It's kind of that one-stop shop. So you can find a link to the course there, as well as the MWEE guide and the educator's toolbox. So that's kind of a broad swath of what we do. I hope I didn't go through too quickly. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to hang around, and my email address is there, and this is the link to the MWEE course. I guess I didn't put Bay Backpack on the last slide, so Annie, maybe we could send that out.
Yeah, we can send that out, and I think I've linked to it a couple times in the chat already if you want to scroll up the chat. So we have Marianne has a question about in the online course. So thank you very much, Elise, first. Thank you. And Marianne was wondering, with the online course, are there opportunities for online support, like peer-to-peer, program leader to teacher, or social networking? It seems like it's pretty much a standalone. Well, so curious about how you're working that into your professional development, like in-person opportunities. Are there hybrid people doing this as a hybrid way of learning, or yeah.
That's a great question. So the MWEE 101 right now, it's just a standalone resource. There are 2 more courses that are being rolled out. So the second course, there's actually a separate section for each state or region, because DC will be included in there. And that will be facilitated by the Department of Education and a couple of nonprofit partners, as well as probably us. And it will be open and accessible all the time, but there'll be facilitated sessions that will be held in likely the winter and the summer. There's a couple details to be worked out there still. So, and these courses are also available for continuing professional development credits for our teachers. So yes, there's a variety of different opportunities. And like our Climate Academy, for example, that's an all facilitated peer-to-peer, submitting different ideas and getting feedback, doing group work. We're trying to incorporate the best practices for online learning in there. But yeah, the MWEE 101 course is right now very much a standalone resource. They do get feedback on when they complete their Think Clouds and their ELM models and things like that, but a lot of it is just like answering questions.
I'm just curious about, since we run a series of online courses, who winds up giving them the feedback on the
Me.
class? You do. Okay, that's what I.
So that's like the thing, yeah, like one of the, obviously the heavy lifts of an online course is there has to be somebody behind the scenes doing all the work. But right now that's myself, but there's somebody else who's coming on board that will be more focused on that, I believe.
Okay.
But it is like, that's one of our biggest challenges, is trying to figure out how to balance that work.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so we have a question about people. You just rolled out this course, right?
Yep. Yeah. So beginning of February, we rolled the course out.
Yeah. So we had a question about how many people are completing it per month, but I would imagine that you don't have a good sense of that yet.
Yeah, we don't have a good sense right now. I mean, we've had a lot of like hits, a lot of people signing on and making accounts and like looking through the content for sure. As far as kind of what our plan of attack is we're working with mostly non-formal and universities to have them incorporate this into their professional development starting this summer. Okay. So we really want to see that this course is being utilized before we spend too much time and effort into that second module. We're kind of hedging our bets though, and we already have the Maryland version pretty set to go. But yeah, that's kind of the goal. And then teacher administrators and curriculum specialists are also thinking about ways to incorporate it into just like regular PD that they offer for their districts.
Thanks. And wondering whether there's any interest in taking the online experiences or the courses internationally, and if there's or if NOAA has conversations with other similar agencies in other countries about what they're doing in their countries to do similar experiences.
That's interesting. So I think that's over my pay grade, but I know that we're thinking, we're working with the NOAA Office of Education to think about how this course might be used on a more national scale. So right now, I would say that the Chesapeake Bay region is really leading the efforts in the MWEE. So probably our first step would be getting this out to the other 7 or the other 6 regions. And then even further than that, because the MWEE model could be, certainly applied in areas that aren't coastal too. And then maybe international would be the next conversation. I love the idea. It's exciting, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily on our 5-year work plan.
Yeah. So we have somebody wondering, what strategies do you use that connecting to pre-service teachers can be really challenging? And so how does the NOAA office connect to pre-service teachers to get them the course and to do the professional development that you all do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with BWET, we fund different people to do that. So right now, Towson University has a BWET grant that is allowing them to start to explore that. We see it as kind of an emerging field, and there's a lot of conversations at other universities, but it is challenging because environmental education isn't necessarily, on the books everywhere. There's definitely a lot of barriers, and I wouldn't say that NOAA specifically is involved in that, but our grant funding, we have an interest in supporting that.
Okay. So if you were applying for a BWET grant, and how often do the BWET grants come up?
Every year. So the FFO usually releases in mid to early December and closes in late February. Okay. So yeah, we just closed applications for this year.
So if you were interested in applying for one of those, then having some pre-service and connecting with pre-service teachers might be one, or attempting to do that would be one good portion of a grant, or that would be looked upon favorably?
Perhaps.
Okay. Right. I'm sorry.
But also, something else to consider is that, so BWET doesn't open and close. The different regions have different dates that they're open. So if you're in California, perhaps your BWET might be open right now, and you should consult with your program officer about kind of what their priorities are. And it's usually pretty detailed in the funding opportunity.
Okay. Excellent. So Fan He from China is saying that we have a science class instead of nature for primary school in China in 2017. So so it is now a little bit more likely to do something like a MWEE in school in China. And she did a series of activities really like the MWEE in Shanghai. I just want to make sure, I think SH is Shanghai, with college school professors that mixed investigations and learning outcomes. So cool.
That sounds fantastic. Yeah. I wonder, is in the United States, oftentimes we see elementary teachers not really having the robust science background that you might see at like the high school or even the middle school level. I wonder if that's is that similar in China?
I have no idea. Maybe. So yeah, for those of you in the call from China, do you feel like your elementary school teachers are really know a lot about science, or do they need a lot of extra support when it comes to science-based learning and teaching? Elise, I had another question that now has fallen out of my head, but I'm sure it will come back to me. Okay, so it differs a lot. It differs a lot in different areas in China. I think that's probably pretty similar in the U.S. too.
Yeah.
Elise, do you want to talk about your youth environmental action summit briefly?
Yeah, sure.
Are you using the MWEE approach with that summit?
Yeah. So we're partnering with another local organization here on the Eastern Shore, specifically just 3 counties, so it's pretty small scale. And so there are these youth climate summits, which I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with. It sounds like your colleague Annie maybe is really familiar with them.
Yeah.
And so we're using that model of bringing together students to engage in, some of these dialogues around climate and other environmental issues. And we are using the MWEE approach. So we provided a teacher or a mentor training because we're working with both formal educators as well as kind of community leaders and people who might be those trusted messengers in the community to work with students to kind of bring them through this MWEE continuum of, issue investigation, synthesis and conclusions, ideally an outdoor field experience, although there's been maybe that hasn't been perfectly embedded this year. And then the students create an action project and they submit this proposal to the Youth Environmental Action Summit. And really the big outcome that we're trying to get here is that student-directed action. So the trainings that we provided for our mentors were all about different ways to facilitate in the classroom and in non-formal settings to get students thinking about options for solutions to address their issues, and really taking that step back approach and allowing for youth voice to really rise to the top of the room. So that's kind of where we're headed and what's happening. And our summit is on Friday, April 5th, which is really soon. And we have tons of action projects that are rolling in. And some of them are really amazing and just things that you wouldn't think about, as an adult, as something that is, matters to us, or maybe as a solution either. So
Cool.
There's a lot of really great things that are coming out of that. And I'll mention that Earth Force, for those of you guys who are interested in student-directed action, is a really great resource. They have a ton of tools around criteria-based decision-making and democratic decision-making that are really effective for both teachers and non-formal educators when it comes to making some of these decisions, because that tends to be, where some of the rubber meets the road when designing action projects.
Awesome. And I just put the link to Earth Force in the chat. And I think if we don't have, do we have any additional questions? We've got just a couple minutes left. And if not, thank you so much, Elise. And I kind of cut you, I realized I just cut you off. Did you need to, if you have a thought to finish, I'm really sorry.
Oh no, you're totally, that's good. Perfect.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, thank you so much, Elise, for a wonderful webinar. And we'll be in touch at the Civic Ecology Lab with, we don't have another webinar planned for next month, but we'll hope to get one on the books within the next couple months. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Elise, for presenting. And this was recorded, so we will be posting this on our YouTube channel. It will be posted to our Facebook pages, and will be sent out via email. And then we'll also be sending it out to our WeChat groups. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks, everyone.
All right, have a wonderful day.